Hello, listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Colt Drennan, and I need to tell you what happened to us. Because if you're hearing this, there's a chance you're running too. And maybe what we learned up in the trees can keep you breathing a little longer. Before the world went to hell, I was a fire lookout tower technician for the United States Forest Service, Pacific Northwest region. That's a mouthful, I know. What it meant in practice was that I drove a government truck down logging roads nobody else remembered existed, climbed rusted ladders bolted to wooden posts and steel legs 60, sometimes 80 feet in the air. And I inspected the old fire lookout towers that dot the Cascade Range like leftover teeth in a broken jaw. Most of them were built in the 1930s and 40s by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Some were staffed every summer. Most had been abandoned for decades. My job was to assess structural integrity, replace corroded hardware, retension guy wires, inspect the lightning rod grounding systems, patch roof panels, and write reports that almost nobody read. I'd spend 3 or 4 days a week up in the mountains with a socket set, a torque wrench, a harness, and a thermos of coffee that was never hot enough by the time I got to the top. I knew those towers the way a mechanic knows the underside of a car. I knew which ones had solid L4 steel undercarriages and which ones were held together by 60-year-old lag bolts and stubbornness. I knew which catwalks were rated for 300 pounds and which ones I wouldn't trust with a wet dog. I knew which cab windows still sealed and which ones let in horizontal rain. I knew which trapdoors had functional hasps and which ones had been pried open by teenagers or bears. I could tell you the tower number, the elevation, the access road condition, and the last date of maintenance for about 40 towers across 3 national forests. That knowledge was worth almost nothing before. It turned out to be worth everything after. My wife, Linnea, she was a veterinary technician at a mixed practice clinic in Estacada, Oregon. Cattle, horses, dogs, cats, the occasional ornery goat. She had steady hands, an iron stomach, and she could suture a wound on a thrashing animal in bad light. She was tougher than me in most ways that mattered, and I say that without any self-pity. It's just a fact. We had 2 kids. Mateo was 7, Piper was 4. We lived in a rented house off Highway 224, 15 minutes from the Clackamas River, surrounded by Douglas firs so thick you couldn't see our roof from the road. Ordinary life, ordinary people. We paid our truck insurance late sometimes. We argued about the water heater. Linnea wanted to replace it. I said I could fix it. I couldn't fix it. The first thing I noticed, and I want to be honest, I didn't notice it as a sign. I noticed it the way you notice a cloud that might rain. Just a flicker. I was driving back from Tower 14 up on Bull of the Woods when I realized I hadn't passed a single car on Forest Road 46 in over 2 hours. That road, in late September, you'd normally see at least a few hunters, some hikers, maybe a logging crew. Nothing. Just wet asphalt and fog. I remember I turned the radio on, and it was emergency broadcast tone on 3 stations in a row. I switched to AM and caught a Bend station talking about a quarantine corridor being established along Interstate 84 east of the Dalles. The word they used was containment. I turned it off because Mateo was in his booster seat behind me, and he could read the mood in my voice even when I said nothing. At home that night, Linnea told me something had been wrong at the clinic for a week. They'd had 3 dogs brought in with identical symptoms: profound lethargy, then sudden aggression, then seizure, then death. One of them bit a tech named Rory through his glove. The wound got infected fast, the kind of fast that doesn't match any normal bacterial timeline. Rory went home sick on a Tuesday. By Thursday, he was in the ICU at Providence, Portland, By Friday, his wife stopped answering calls. Linnea told me this while she was packing lunches for the next day. And her hands didn't shake, but she lined the sandwiches up too carefully, the way she did when she was scared and didn't want the kids to see. The next few days, things just kept subtracting. The garbage truck didn't come. The school sent an automated message saying in-person classes were suspended for 2 weeks pending a public health review. The gas station on 224 had a line 14 cars deep and a hand-lettered sign that said, "Cash only, 20-gallon limit." I filled both our vehicles and the 2 5-gallon jerry cans I kept for the chainsaw. I didn't tell Linnea why. I think she already knew. Then came the night we heard the helicopters. Not one or two. A steady procession of them heading east over the ridge, low enough that the rotor wash shook our bedroom window. Military. Blackhawks, I think, though I'm no expert. That sound went on for 40 minutes. Mateo came into our room and crawled between us without saying a word. Piper slept through it. She could sleep through a sawmill. The next morning, I drove to the Estacada Safeway for water and canned food. The parking lot was full, but the store was half empty. Not of people, of product. The shelves looked like someone had run a snowplow down every aisle. I got what I could. Beans, tuna, peanut butter, powdered milk, rice, ibuprofen, 2 cases of bottled water, a bag of dog food even though we didn't have a dog, because protein is protein, and I'd read that somewhere years ago and it stuck. The cashier was a teenage girl who looked like she hadn't slept. She said, "Are you going east?" I said no. She said, "Don't go east." I want to tell you about the first time I saw one of them. I won't pretend I was brave. I was in the truck, alone, on a supply run for fuel stabilizer and duct tape at the hardware store in Ripplebrook, which was really just a ranger station with a small general store attached. I pulled in, and the lot was empty, except for a green Subaru with the driver's door open. Engine off. Keys on the ground. There was a man in a brown canvas jacket face down on the pavement, about 30 feet from the car. I thought heart attack. I thought stroke. I got out, and I was about 15 feet from him when he moved. It wasn't the way a person moves. The limbs went first, this jerky, involuntary extension, like a spider that's been sprayed with something toxic and is trying to right itself. Then he pushed up from the asphalt and turned toward me, and I saw his face. And I stopped walking. His eyes were wrong. Not the color, the focus. There was no recognition in them. No pain, no confusion, no fear. Just a flat, predatory fixation, like a dog locked onto a squirrel, except there was nothing behind it. No thought, just drive. He came at me at a stumbling run. Not fast, not slow, determined. I got back in the truck and closed the door, and he hit the driver's side panel with his shoulder and clawed at the window with fingers that were already torn up, nails split, knuckles skinned raw. He left a smear of something dark and wet on the glass. I put it in reverse and backed out, and he followed for about 50 yards before he lost interest or lost coordination. I couldn't tell which. I drove home at 70 miles an hour on a road rated for 35, and I told Linnea everything. And she listened. And then she said something I will never forget. She said, "Where do we go that they can't follow?" And I said, "Up." See, I'd been turning it over in my head since the helicopters. Ground level was a death sentence. Every house, every store, every school is designed for easy human access. Doors, windows, ramps, hallways. That's the whole point of architecture. Welcoming, accessible. Which means anything that used to be a person can walk right in. You can board windows, you can barricade doors, but you're still on the ground. And on the ground, you can be surrounded. And once you're surrounded, you're in a box. and a box with things clawing at every wall is not a shelter. It's a coffin you built yourself, but a fire lookout tower, 60 or 70 feet in the air, with a single steel ladder as the only access point, with a cab designed to withstand lightning and 100-mile-an-hour wind, with 360 visibility in every direction. That's something else entirely. That's a castle with the drawbridge up. Nobody looks up. I'd learned that over years of working on those towers. Hikers would walk right under one and never see the cab through the canopy. Animals never climbed the steel ladders. And those things I'd seen, the infected, the turned, whatever the word would eventually be, they weren't climbers. They weren't planners. They were ground predators, clumsy and persistent. And persistence doesn't help you when the first rung is 9 feet off the forest floor and you've lost the motor control to grip a steel bar. I sat down at the kitchen table that night after the kids were asleep, and I wrote the list. Linnea sat across from me with a road atlas open to the Cascade Range. And I told her every tower I knew, its condition, its elevation, its access road, its water proximity, its structural rating. We narrowed it by elimination. Not Tower 22, too close to the highway, too exposed. Not Tower 9, the cab roof had a hole I hadn't repaired yet. Not Tower 31, the ladder bolts on the second section were suspect, and I hadn't torqued them since spring. We landed on Tower 16. Tower 16. Bald Ridge Lookout. Elevation 5,800 feet. Situated on a rocky knob above a mixed conifer forest, about 14 miles up a gated Forest Service road off of Route 224. Steel leg design, L4 pattern, meaning 4 legs in a square footprint, cross-braced with angle iron, standing 62 feet from pad to catwalk. The cab was a standard 14 by 14 foot room with tempered glass on all 4 sides, a plywood floor over a steel frame, a catwalk around the perimeter with a waist-high railing, and a trap door in the floor that opened onto the final ladder section. The roof was standing seam metal with a lightning rod and ground wire. I had inspected it in June. Every bolt was tight, every guy wire was tensioned. The glass was intact. The trap door had a working hasp and could accept a padlock. It was the soundest tower in my rotation, and it sat on a ridge with clear sight lines in every direction for miles. If anything approached, we would see it long before it reached the base. The list I wrote that night was simple. I still have the scrap of paper. It said, water containers and filter, food for 4 people, 30 days minimum, sleeping bags and blankets, stove and fuel, medical kit, tools and fasteners, tarps, rope, radio, batteries, weapons. We spent the next day loading the truck. I won't describe every item because that would take an hour, but I'll tell you the method. We went room by room through our own house first. Everything that could keep us warm, fed, hydrated, or defended went into the truck bed or the cab. Then I drove to the hardware store, the real one in Estacada, not the ranger station. It was closed, but the door was unlocked, and the owner, a man named Dale Presswick, who had sold me lag bolts for 15 years, was dead on the floor behind the counter. I won't describe what had been done to him. I took what I needed, a small cast-iron wood stove, the kind they sell for ice fishing shanties, about 18 inches tall, with a 6-inch flue collar, 30 feet of single-wall stovepipe in 6-inch diameter, a stovepipe rain cap, high-temperature silicon sealant, self-tapping sheet metal screws, a hand drill and bits, 2 rolls of foil-faced insulation, 100 feet of paracord, zip ties, a box of heavy-duty contractor trash bags, cable clamps, turnbuckles, 3 padlocks, keyed alike, a bow saw, a hatchet, 2 tarps, 1 blue, 1 gray, The gray was better. Blue catches the eye. I left money on the counter beside Dale. I know that sounds stupid. It was stupid, but I did it. From the clinic, Linnea brought suture kits, antibiotics, analgesics, antiseptic, bandages, a veterinary surgical kit that was better than anything you'd find in a home first aid box, and 4 bottles of ketamine, which is a sedative and anesthetic that works on humans too, in case one of us needed emergency surgery and there was no hospital left to go to. She was thinking ahead of me. She usually was. We left at 4 in the morning. I chose that hour because the roads would be empty, and because the infected, from what I'd seen and heard, were more active in daylight. I don't know if that was true everywhere. It was true enough for us. I had the truck loaded past its payload rating, and the suspension was bottomed out on every bump. Linnea rode passenger with Piper in her lap. Mateo was in the back seat with sleeping bags piled around him like a nest. He had his headlamp on and was reading a book about volcanoes. 7 years old, and the world is ending, and he's reading about magma chambers. Kids are better at this than we are. The drive was 14 miles on pavement, and then 8 miles on gravel, and then 4 miles on a forest road that was more suggestion than surface. I had the gate key on my forest service ring. We passed through and I locked it behind us. The road climbed through old-growth fir and hemlock, switchbacking up the ridge in hairpin turns, and twice I had to get out and drag fallen branches off the track. Both times, I stood in the dark with a flashlight and a crowbar and listened to the forest and heard nothing but wind and my own heartbeat. And I want to tell you that silence in the woods at 3,000 feet in the dark, when you know what's out there, is a sound in itself. It has weight. We reached the tower clearing at 5:50 in the morning. Gray light, frost on the grass. The tower stood exactly as I'd last seen it. A steel skeleton rising out of the rock and scrubbed like a monument to stubbornness. I killed the engine and we sat in the truck for a full minute just looking at it. Linnea reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "It's ugly." I said, "Yeah." She said, "I love it." Getting the supplies up was the hardest physical labor of my life. The tower ladder was in 3 sections. The bottom section started 9 feet above ground, accessed by a wooden stepladder that the Forest Service left chained to one of the legs. I unchained it, and for the next 6 hours, Linnea and I hauled everything up in loads. I rigged a rope and pulley system using a carabiner and the catwalk railing, so for the heavy items, the stove, the water containers, the food boxes, I'd tie them off at the base, and Linnea would haul from above, while I guided from below. The kids sat in the cab, with strict instructions not to touch anything or open the trap door. Mateo took the instructions seriously. Piper drew on the windows with her finger. When everything was up, I pulled the wooden stepladder and hauled it onto the catwalk. Then I used cable clamps to fix it horizontally along the railing, so it was out of the way, but accessible if we needed it. Without that stepladder, the first rung of the steel ladder was 9 feet above ground. I checked that clearance twice with a tape measure. 9 feet 2 inches. Nothing I had seen suggested those things could jump. Nothing suggested they could plan. 9 feet of air was our moat, and I intended to keep it that way. The first night in the tower, I didn't sleep. Linnea took the kids into the corner farthest from the trap door and made a nest of sleeping bags and blankets, and they were out within minutes, exhausted from the climb and the fear they were too young to name, but old enough to feel. I sat by the east-facing window, with the trap door locked beneath me, and I watched the forest and I listened. The cab creaked in the wind. The guy wires hummed a low tone that changed pitch as the gusts shifted. Somewhere below, an owl called twice and stopped. I could see the glow of fires to the west, far away, down in the valley where Estacada was. or had been. The glow pulsed and faded and pulsed again. And I didn't know if it was buildings burning or signal fires or something worse. And I decided not to think about it, because thinking about what you can't change in the dark is how you lose your mind. And I couldn't afford to lose my mind. I had 3 people depending on me in a 14 by 14 foot room and a list of problems to solve. And that list was going to keep me sane. Cold was the first enemy on the list. At 5,800 feet in the Oregon Cascades in October, nighttime temperatures drop into the 20s. The cab, for all its virtues, was essentially a glass box on stilts. The original builders never intended it for winter habitation. The single-pane windows radiated cold inward like open freezers, and the plywood floor conducted heat straight down into the steel frame. By midnight of that first night, my breath was fogging, and Piper was shivering in her sleep. I started with the floor. I laid down the foil-faced insulation in overlapping sheets, foil side up, stapled at the edges. Over that, I put one of the tarps, the gray one, folded double. Over that, the sleeping bags and blankets. It wasn't elegant, but it created a dead-air barrier between us and the steel. The difference was immediate, not warm, less cold. In survival, those are not the same thing, but the gap between them is where you live. The windows I addressed with contractor trash bags. I know how that sounds. But a black plastic bag, stretched flat and taped over a window with duct tape, creates an air gap between the plastic and the glass, and that gap is insulation. Not much. Enough. I covered 3 of the 4 window walls entirely, leaving the south-facing windows partly clear for light and observation. The cab went from a glass box to a dark, slightly warmer box that smelled like plastic and wood and cold metal. The kids thought it was a fort. We let them think that. Heat was the harder problem. The ice fishing stove was small but functional. Cast iron, about 40 pounds, with a flat top for cooking and a 6-inch flue collar. Installing a wood stove in a fire lookout tower is an irony that wasn't lost on me. The original towers often had small stoves. Tower 16 didn't, but it had a capped 6-inch hole in the roof where a stove flue had once passed through in the 1940s. I found it under a sheet metal patch, removed the patch with a screwdriver, and there it was. A clean 6-inch penetration with a steel collar still intact. Somebody in 1943 had done the work, and somebody in 1972 had covered it up, and now, in whatever year this was becoming, I was putting it back to use. I set the stove on a piece of sheet metal I'd cut from the truck's bed liner, giving it a non-combustible pad. I ran the stovepipe straight up through the roof penetration and sealed the gap with high-temperature silicone. I topped it with a rain cap, which would also serve as a spark arrestor. The total run was about 6 feet of pipe, dead vertical, which gave good draft. I cracked the south window about 1 inch for makeup air, which is the air the stove needs to draw in to replace what it sends up the chimney. Without makeup air, a stove in a sealed room will backdraft and fill the space with carbon monoxide. And then you die in your sleep. And I wasn't going to survive the end of the world, only to be killed by a physics problem I already understood. The first fire I lit was small. Dry kindling from deadfall I'd collected below. The stove drew immediately. A soft roar that settled into a steady tick of expanding metal. And within 20 minutes, the cab temperature rose from 31 degrees to 48. Linnea held her hands over the stovetop and closed her eyes, and I saw her shoulders drop for the first time in days. Piper said the stove was a tiny dragon. She wasn't wrong. Fuel management was critical. I couldn't go to the ground every day for wood without exposing myself, so I established a rhythm. Every third day, early morning, I'd descend with the rope, the hatchet, and the bow saw. I'd work fast and quiet within 100-yard radius of the tower base, cutting standing dead wood, which burns cleaner and hotter than green wood or fallen logs because it's already partially seasoned. I'd buck it into 18-inch lengths, bundle it with paracord, and haul it up with the pulley. A good session produced enough fuel for 3 days of conservative burning. I burned only at night when the smoke would be invisible, and I burned only dry, well-seasoned wood to minimize visible smoke during the brief dusk firing-up period. A column of white smoke against a dark tree line is a signal, and I wanted to signal nothing to nobody. Water came next. At 5,800 feet, there was no well, no spring within safe walking distance, and carrying water up a 62-foot ladder is brutal labor. But there was rain. And in October in the Cascades, there is a lot of rain. I rigged a catchment system using the second tarp, the blue one, since its color didn't matter when it was laid out on the roof. I stretched it across the north half of the roof and channeled it into a gutter I made from a split section of stovepipe, angled downward, draining into a 5-gallon bucket hung from the catwalk railing. When it rained, and it rained often, that bucket would fill in under 2 hours. I'd haul it in through the south window and pour it through a filter. The filter was a Sawyer squeeze I'd grabbed from our camping gear, rated for 100,000 gallons. I also kept a pot on the stove for boiling water as a secondary purification step, because redundancy isn't paranoia. Redundancy is the difference between a small problem and a catastrophe. We stored water in every container we had. Bottles, the jerry cans after the fuel was used, Ziploc bags doubled up and laid flat, even the kids' water bottles with the cartoon characters on them. At any given time, I wanted a minimum of 15 gallons in the cab. That's roughly a gallon per person per day for 4 days, with a small margin. Not comfortable, survivable. The distinction between those two words became the operating principle of everything we did. Light and power were handled with discipline, not abundance. I had a hand-crank radio that also had a small LED light and a USB charging port. I had 4 headlamps with spare batteries. I had a small solar panel, a 20-watt folding unit from our camping kit, that I could lay on the south-facing catwalk railing during daylight hours to trickle charge a power bank. The power bank ran the radio and could charge a phone, though the phone had no signal. I kept the phone for its camera, its compass app, and its stored maps. Light discipline was absolute. After dark, no white light visible from outside. Headlamps only, on red mode, aimed at the floor. The stove gave enough glow through its air intake to see shapes in the cab, and our eyes adjusted. Piper was afraid of the dark for the first 2 nights. By the 3rd night, she wasn't. Children adapt faster than adults because they haven't yet learned to mourn what normal used to look like. Waste was the problem nobody wants to think about, and everyone has to solve. I'm going to be direct about this, because if you're ever in a survival situation, squeamishness will kill you faster than most threats. Human waste in an enclosed space is a disease vector, period. I designated the northwest corner of the catwalk as the latrine. I cut a hole in a 5-gallon bucket, lined it with contractor bags, and set it in the corner behind a tarp screen for privacy. After each use, a scoop of wood ash from the stove went in to reduce odor and accelerate decomposition. When the bag was 2/3 full, I'd tie it off, lower it by rope, and bury it at least 50 yards from the tower base downhill. This was one of the tasks I hated most. But the system worked. There was no smell in the cab, no fly problem, no disease. Discipline in the unglamorous things is what separates the living from the dead. And I mean that literally. Access control was the last system and the most important. The tower had a single point of entry, the trap door in the cab floor, which opened onto the top ladder section. Below that, 3 sections of steel ladder bolted to the tower legs, running in a zigzag pattern with small landing platforms at each transition. At the bottom, a 9-foot gap between the ground and the first rung. I'd already removed the access stepladder. But I went further. I took the remaining cable clamps and paracord and rigged a system where the bottom 2 ladder sections could be unbolted and swung upward on their top hinges, essentially raising the drawbridge. This was brutal work. Each section weighed about 60 pounds, and the bolts were rusted. But I had penetrating oil, a breaker bar, and motivation. Once raised, the bottom of the accessible ladder was now roughly 34 feet above the ground. Nothing was climbing that. Nothing. For our own access, I left a knotted climbing rope that we could lower and raise from the catwalk. To go down, you'd lower the rope, descend hand over hand or with a friction wrap, do your business on the ground, then climb back up and we'd haul the rope. It was exhausting and dangerous, and I hated it. But it was secure. One way up, one way down. We controlled both. High ground, one way in, a single choke point. I said that phrase so many times it became a kind of prayer. The trapdoor itself I reinforced with a cross brace of angle iron, bolted through the original plywood and into the steel frame. I added a heavy-duty barrel bolt on the inside and one of the padlocks. When that trapdoor was locked, you'd need a battering ram or a cutting torch to get through it, and last I checked, the dead weren't carrying either. Days settled into a rhythm that felt almost like living. We woke with the light. Linnea checked the water stores and started the stove. I'd do a 360 scan from the catwalk with binoculars, checking the tree line, the access road, the ridge to the south. Mateo had a small journal where he kept a weather log. Temperature, wind direction, cloud type, precipitation. He took it incredibly seriously. Piper helped Linnea sort supplies, which mostly meant she counted things and announced the totals with the authority of a bank auditor. We ate twice a day, oatmeal or rice in the morning, beans or canned protein in the evening, supplemented with whatever I could forage below. I found a thicket of wild hazelnuts about 200 yards west and marked it with a discreet blaze on a tree. I set snare lines for rabbits. Linnea knew animal anatomy well enough to dress small game efficiently. And she taught Mateo how to do it too, because she said knowledge should never live in only one person's hands. And she was right. By the time the first snow fell, 11 days in, we had what I would cautiously call a functioning homestead, 62 feet in the air. The stove kept the cab above freezing even on the coldest nights. The water catchment, now supplemented by melting snow in a pot, provided enough for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene. The food stores, carefully rationed, were projected to last another 3 weeks, maybe longer, with the snares and forage supplementing. The waste system worked. The access was locked down. We were, by any objective measure, surviving. But survival and safety are not the same thing. And the forest reminded us of that on the 15th day. I was on the catwalk doing a morning scan when I saw movement on the access road below. 3 figures moving uphill through the trees. Not infected. The infected didn't move in groups with purpose. These figures moved with spacing and intent. They were alive, and they were heading toward us. Linnea came out beside me and watched through the binoculars for a long moment, and then handed them back and said, "2 women and a man. The man has a rifle. One of the women is limping." I told the kids to stay inside, stay quiet, and not open the trap door. Then I waited until the three of them reached the clearing at the base of the tower and stood there looking up at the steel legs and the empty gap where the ladder should have been. They looked tired. They looked scared. The man saw me on the catwalk and raised a hand, palm open. Not a threat gesture, a request. He called up, "We saw the smoke last night, just barely. Please, we've been walking for 3 days." I didn't answer immediately. I watched them. The limping woman sat down on a rock and put her head in her hands. The other woman stood close to her, hand on her shoulder. The man kept his rifle slung, barrel down. Everything in their posture said exhaustion, not ambush. But trust is a resource you spend carefully when one mistake means your children die. I called down. "I need to ask you questions, and I need honest answers. Lie to me, and we're done." He nodded. "Has anyone in your group been bitten?" "No." "Deep scratches from an infected? Any contact with blood that isn't yours?" "No, nothing like that." "Anyone running a fever? Chills, confusion? Anybody feeling wrong and not saying so?" The man looked at the two women. They shook their heads. He said, "No. We're exhausted, and the knee is bad, but nobody's sick. I swear on my life." Swearing on your life is easy. If I let you up here and one of you turns, it's my kids' lives. So I'm asking you again. He went quiet. Then the woman standing said, "My name is Adrian Ota. I was a structural engineer with the city of Portland. This is June. She's my partner. The man is Glenn Ferris. He was our neighbor. We left Milwaukee 6 days ago when the cordon failed. If any of us had been bitten or scratched, I would tell you. Because if I thought I was turning, I'd be nowhere near another living person. That's just basic. That's just being a human being." I looked at Linnea. She studied them for a long time. Then she said quietly, "The woman who spoke, the engineer, she'd be useful." I called down. "I'm going to lower a rope. You send the rifle up first, unloaded, bolt open. Then you climb one at a time. The limping woman goes in the middle so someone can spot her from below and someone can pull from above. When you're in the cab, you follow our rules. No exceptions." Glenn nodded and said, "What are the rules?" "I'll tell you when you're up here. First rule you can have now. No solo hero moves. Nobody goes down alone. Nobody makes decisions alone. We survive as a group or we die as individuals." It took almost an hour to get all three of them up. June's knee was badly swollen, and the rope climb was agony for her. But she didn't cry out. She set her teeth and pulled, and Linnea hauled from above. And when she came through the trap door, she lay on the floor, breathing hard. And Piper brought her a cup of water and said, "This is our sky house." June laughed. It was the first time anyone in the tower had laughed in days. And the sound startled me. How human it was. How necessary. That night, with 7 people in a 14 by 14 room, the warmth problem was actually easier. Body heat is a resource. We rearranged the sleeping area to accommodate 3 more, which meant everyone was closer and nobody was against a cold wall. Adrian, the structural engineer, walked the catwalk that first evening with a flashlight and inspected every connection, every bolt, every weld she could see, and came back in and told me the tower was in excellent shape, which I already knew. But hearing it from a structural engineer was like getting a second opinion from a specialist who agrees with your diagnosis. Glenn, it turned out, had been an electrician for 30 years. He looked at my solar panel setup and within a day had re-rigged it with better wire connections, angled the panel more precisely for the October sun angle, and nearly doubled the charging rate. He ran a small LED strip along the inside of the cab's ceiling, powered by the battery bank. Dim enough not to be visible from outside, but bright enough to read by. He cried a little while he was wiring it, not from grief exactly, but from the relief of having something to do with his hands that he understood. I knew that feeling. The worst part of the end of the world isn't the danger. It's the helplessness. Give a person a task that matches their skills, and you've given them a reason to see tomorrow. Adrienne earned her place within the first week. She assessed the tower legs and recommended I add diagonal bracing to the east-facing pair, which was taking the most wind load. We scavenged angle iron from the remains of an old cable gate down the road, and she showed me where to drill and bolt it. She also designed a modification to the trap door that allowed us to crack it open 3 inches for ventilation without it being wide enough for a hand to reach through. Simple, brilliant. The kind of thing an engineer sees that a technician doesn't. The first real test came on day 22. We'd had frost every night for a week, and the forest had gone quiet, in the way that means either the animals are gone or they're hiding. I was on pre-dawn watch, sitting in the east window with a cup of boiled water that was pretending to be coffee, when I heard engines. Not one engine, several. Low, heavy, diesel. I got the binoculars and scanned the access road. 2 pickup trucks and what looked like a modified flatbed were grinding up the switchbacks about a mile below. They had their headlights off. That told me everything I needed to know. People driving without headlights on a mountain road in the dark aren't lost. They're hunting. I woke everyone quietly, whispered it. Vehicles below, multiple. Lights off. Assume hostile. The routine kicked in. Linnea gathered the kids into the corner, wrapped in blankets to muffle any sound. Glenn killed the LED strip. Adrienne and I checked the trapdoor locks twice. June, bad knee and all, positioned herself at the south window with the binoculars. I had Glenn's rifle. I'm not a great shot. I'm adequate. At 62 feet of elevation, and with a choke point, adequate was enough. The trucks reached the clearing about 20 minutes later and stopped. 5 men got out. They were armed, well armed, rifles and at least 1 shotgun. And they moved with the kind of loose confidence that comes from having already taken things from people. They weren't military. Military moves with discipline. These men moved like they owned whatever they were standing on. One of them shone a flashlight up at the tower, and the beam swept across the cab, and I pulled back from the window. He said something I couldn't hear, and 2 of them laughed. They walked the perimeter of the base, saw the missing ladder sections, and one of them kicked the steel leg and swore. The sound rang up through the frame, and I felt it in my boots. They couldn't get up. 9 feet to the first rung was now 34 feet to the lowest accessible point. And even that only reached a landing with nothing above it but the raised sections. They had no ladder long enough. They looked for the wooden stepladder that should have been there, and it wasn't because it was on our catwalk. One of them fired a rifle shot into the air, I think, to provoke a reaction, to see if anyone would look out. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loud. Piper had her face pressed against Linnea's chest, and Matteo had his hands over his ears, and his eyes were closed, and he was counting silently. I could see his lips moving, counting to keep himself somewhere else. They stayed for 40 minutes. They searched the truck, which I'd moved under the tree canopy and covered with branches, but which they found anyway. They took the remaining fuel from the jerry cans. They took the spare tire. They tried to hotwire it, but the battery was dead because I'd removed it weeks ago and carried it to the cab for exactly this reason. Because a truck you can't start is a truck they can't drive away. Eventually they got back in their vehicles and drove down the mountain, and the sound of their engines faded, and still nobody in the cab moved for another full hour. When Linnea finally spoke, she said, "They'll come back." I said, "Maybe." She said, "They'll come back with a ladder." I said, "Then we'll deal with the ladder." That night, I rigged a system I'd been thinking about, but hoping I'd never need. I took the remaining paracord and strung it in a web pattern between the tower legs at the base, about 2 feet off the ground. Tight enough to trip, but loose enough to be invisible in low light. I hung small pieces of metal from it, washers, bolts, a few old carabiners, so that any contact would make noise. It wasn't a defense. It was an alarm. In the dark, from 60 feet up, you can't see what's at the base, but you can hear it. I also prepared what I called the denial system, and I'm not proud of it, but I'll describe it, because survival isn't proud. I took the 2 remaining jerry cans, filled them with a mix of stove fuel and cooking oil, and positioned them on the catwalk above the only approach to the remaining ladder section. If someone brought a ladder and leaned it against the tower and started climbing, I could pour the mix down the ladder rungs from above. You can't grip a steel rung covered in oil. You can't climb what you can't hold. And if they brought fire, the oil wouldn't help them either, because it would be on them, not on the tower, and they'd have to descend to survive. I told Linnea about it, and she said nothing for a long time, and then said, "Good." They didn't come back. Not those men, at least. I don't know why. Maybe they found easier targets. Maybe the road became impassable. Maybe they met something on the way down that they couldn't shoot their way past. The forest holds its own counsel and doesn't share. But the infected came. Of course they did. Day 29, early December, the first group wandered into the clearing. 7 of them. They came from the south, out of the tree line, moving in that stiff, relentless gait that I'd come to know and dread. They weren't together in any social sense. They were just drifting in the same direction, pulled by whatever remnant of instinct drives them, towards sound, towards scent, towards something we couldn't perceive. They reached the base of the tower, and they stood there. Some of them walked in slow circles. One pressed against a steel leg and stayed there, leaning like a cow against a fence post. Another kept reaching upward, arms extended, fingers grasping at nothing, reaching for the first rung that was 34 feet above its head. The sound it made was somewhere between a moan and a breath, not loud, continuous. That sound went on for 3 days. 3 days. 72 hours. They didn't leave. They didn't tire. 2 more drifted in on the second day, making 9. They stood below us, and they looked up with those empty eyes, and they waited. And waiting is the worst thing an enemy can do, because waiting costs them nothing, and cost you everything. We couldn't go down for wood. We couldn't go down for water if the catchment ran low. We couldn't lower the waste bags. We burned fuel carefully, metering it, and the temperature in the cab dropped as we stretched our reserves. On the second night, it hit 19 degrees outside, and the water in the catch bucket on the catwalk froze solid, and Piper got a cough that scared me more than anything below. On the third morning, I was on the catwalk, looking down at them, and I noticed that 2 had wandered away during the night. By midday, 3 more had drifted toward the tree line, following some stimulus I couldn't detect. By sunset, only 2 remained at the base, and one of those was the leaner, who I think may have actually been unable to walk anymore. The other stood swaying in place. On the morning of the 4th day, they were gone. All of them. The clearing was empty and silent, and there were tracks in the frost and a smell that lingered for hours. That sweet rot smell that is the signature of the infected. The smell of a body that is dying and moving at the same time. I went down that afternoon with the rope and the hatchet and I cut enough wood for a week, and I hauled it up in 4 loads. And I didn't rest until every piece was stacked on the catwalk. That night, I ran the stove hot. Hotter than I should have. Hotter than was tactically wise, because Piper's cough was getting worse, and the cold was the enemy I could fight. Linnea made a steam tent from a tarp and a pot of boiling water with pine needles crushed into it, and she held Piper under it for 20 minutes, and the cough broke, and Piper fell asleep. And I sat by the stove with my hands shaking, not from cold, but from the simple, crushing weight of how close everything is, always, to going wrong. The Bald Ridge lookout still stood. So did we. By the time January came, we had been in the tower for over 3 months. The 7 of us had developed a routine so ingrained, it felt like the tower had always been inhabited. Like we were the latest in a long line of people who had lived above the world and watched it turn below. Glenn maintained the electrical systems and had rigged a small wind vane from scrap metal that charged the battery bank during storms. Adrienne had reinforced 3 more structural connections and designed a rainwater diversion that doubled our catchment in heavy rain. June, whose knees slowly improved, became our inventory manager, tracking every calorie, every aspirin, every foot of cordage with a precision that bordered on obsessive, and was exactly what we needed. Linnea was the medic, the surgeon, the pharmacist, and the person who kept the children's world small enough to feel safe. Matteo kept his weather log and had become genuinely skilled at predicting storms by watching cloud formations and barometric pressure changes on an old analog gauge Glenn had scavenged from the truck's dashboard. Piper drew pictures on every flat surface she could find and narrated elaborate stories to herself that were, as far as I could tell, about a family of bears who lived in a tall tree and were very happy. And me. I was the tradesman. I kept the bolts tight. I kept the stove clean. I kept the guy wires tensioned and the access rope coiled and the tripwire alarm maintained and the trap door locked. I went down for wood and water and came back up. I set snares and checked them. I watched the tree line and counted what moved and estimated what didn't. And every night, before I slept, I looked at the scrap of paper taped to the wall above the trap door, where I had written 6 words in permanent marker. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. That was it. That was the entire doctrine. Every decision we made came back to those 6 words. Is the stove clean? Heat? Is the catchment clear? Water? Are the snares set? Food? Is the battery charged? Power? Is the trapdoor locked? Access? Is the waste managed? Waste. If all 6 were covered, we were surviving. If one was failing, that was the next enemy on the list. I learned something in that tower that I want to pass on. And it's not dramatic, and it won't make a good movie. But it's true. Survival is not a single heroic act. It is the relentless, unglamorous repetition of small, correct decisions. It's checking the stove flue for creosote buildup every 4 days. It's rotating the food stores so nothing expires unnoticed. It's inspecting the rope for fraying before every descent. It's counting every round of ammunition and every bandage and every match. It's asking the question every morning, what is the next thing that could fail? And what do I do about it today? The people who die aren't always the ones who face the biggest threats. Sometimes they're the ones who skip the small maintenance because it's boring or cold or they're tired. A loose bolt on a guy wire in November becomes a structural failure in a January ice storm. A neglected stove flue becomes a chimney fire. A frayed rope becomes a 40-foot fall. You don't die in the catastrophe. You die in the thing you didn't bother to fix 3 weeks before the catastrophe. We had rules. They were simple and they were absolute, and they were posted on the wall next to the 6 words. Nobody goes below alone. Nobody approaches the trapdoor without announcing themselves. Every wound gets cleaned immediately, no matter how small. Every stranger gets the questions: bites, scratches, blood, fever. Every night, someone is on watch. No exceptions for fatigue, for weather, for anything. These rules weren't born from wisdom. They were born from fear. And fear, properly directed, is the most effective survival tool ever invented. I think about the people who didn't make it, not in an abstract way. I think about Dale Presswick on the floor of his hardware store. I think about Rory from the vet clinic. I think about the 5 men in the trucks who took our fuel and drove into the dark. I think about the 9 shapes standing below us in the frost, reaching for a rung they would never touch. I don't hate any of them. I can't afford to. Hate uses energy and attention, and I needed both for the 6 words on the wall. You may never stand on a fire lookout tower like ours. You probably won't. But the principles don't change with the structure. What I'm telling you isn't about a tower. It's about a way of thinking. Find a place you can hold. Not the biggest place, not the most comfortable place, the most defensible place. Somewhere with height, if you can get it, because nobody looks up. Nobody ever does until something falls on them. Somewhere with limited access, because every door is a vulnerability and every window is an invitation. One way in, a single choke point. Know it better than anyone else. Walk its perimeter until you can do it in the dark. Learn which boards creak. Learn which door sticks. Learn where the water pools and where the wind hits hardest and where the blind spots are. Because blind spots are where things go wrong. Make your list. Write it on something that won't wash away. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. Solve them in order of lethality. Exposure kills in hours. Dehydration kills in days. Starvation kills in weeks. A bad access point kills you whenever someone decides to test it. Make rules and enforce them without drama. Rules aren't for the strong days when everyone's fed and warm and the sun is out. Rules are for the bad days, the tired days, the scared days, the days when someone says, just this once. And that just this once is the crack in the wall that brings everything down. Fix the small things. Today, not tomorrow. Not when it's warmer. Not when you have time. You will never have time. Time is a hallucination of the comfortable. The bolt is loose now. Fix it now. The flue needs cleaning now. Clean it now. The rope is frayed now. Replace it now. Because the storm doesn't wait, and the horde doesn't wait, and the cold absolutely does not wait. These things will come whether you're ready or not, and the only variable you control is whether you've done the work. And lastly, and I know how this sounds, but stay human. Keep a child's drawing on the wall. Let someone laugh when the sound of it is the last thing you expected. Let June count the bandages with an intensity that makes no sense and perfect sense at the same time. Let Mateo log the weather like a scientist because the act of measuring gives him control over something that cannot be controlled. Let Piper tell her bear stories. Let Glenn cry while he wires an LED because his hands remember a world that worked. Let Adrienne inspect a bolt pattern for the 4th time because precision is how she holds herself together. These things are not waste. They are not inefficiency. They are the reason you're still bothering to survive at all. We're still up here. The tower still stands. The stove is warm. The trapdoor is locked. Mateo says the barometric pressure is dropping, which means weather's coming, which means the catchment will fill. Piper is asleep. Linnea is on watch. Below us, the forest is dark and vast and full of things that used to be people. And above us, the stars are out. And they look exactly the same as they did before any of this happened, which is either comforting or terrifying, and most nights I can't decide which. If you're out there and you're listening, and you're trying to figure out what to do next, start with the list. Heat, water, food, power, access, waste. Write it down. Pick your structure. Learn its bones. Fix what's broken. Lock the door. Watch the tree line. And when the long night comes, and it will, remember that the people who make it aren't the bravest or the strongest or the luckiest. They're the ones who check the bolts. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next one.